Your line has been muted.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the National 303D TMDL webinar series. My name is Jasper Hobbs with New England Interstate Water Pollution Control Commission, and today's webinar is on stakeholder engagement, featuring a presentation by Dr. Karen Kline from Virginia Tech. Dr. Kline will speak about involving stakeholders in the development of a TMDL implementation plan, and this presentation will focus on the role of stakeholder involvement in creating a successful TMDL implementation plan. It will include an overview of research that examines stakeholder participation during development, as well as identifying the types of stakeholders needed, how to engage them, and their specific contributions in IP development. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping items. Throughout this webinar, your phones will be on mute. There will be a Q&A time after the presentation. Please send your questions to the NUIPIC moderator through the chat function. You can send these questions in any time throughout the webinar, and we will get to them at the end. If you are in full screen, you can just hover your mouse over the top of the screen, and there's an option to hit turn. And this webinar will be recorded and archived on our webpage. After the webinar, there will be a brief evaluation that pops up, just a few quick questions. We're always looking for input on how to better this webinar series, as well as looking for future topic ideas. A complete list of our webinars can be found on NUIPIC's website, along with additional information from some of these webinars and the presentation slides. So here's also my contact information, which I will send out after the webinar. And as soon as this recording is on our website, you will get a notice about that. And now I will pass it over to Dr. Kline.
Thank you, Jasper. So as he said, that we're going to be talking about stakeholder engagement during the implementation planning process or development. So a few housekeeping things before we start, because I have some too. First, I guess we'll just go right into a bit of advice or a hint as far as stakeholder engagement, and it involves acronyms. And so we all know that acronyms are useful, they're convenient, they're easy. We all use them for multiple things. But one of the things I have seen when I have been in TMDL or IP meetings is that stakeholders get frustrated if they don't understand the code. One of the things you need to do when you're developing an IP in your meetings and your working groups is you need to make sure that everyone understands the acronyms. There's nothing wrong with acronyms, we just all need to be on the same page with them. So with that, I'm going to use that advice myself, and we're going to go through a couple that I may be using during the webinar. These are some that I tend to use without thinking about. The first one is IP. And if I say that, or if it's in a slide, it means TMDL implementation plan. I know some other states use different abbreviations like I-plan or things like this. In Virginia, we tend to refer to them as IP. The next one I may say or use is DEQ. And when I say that, I am referring to the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality. I recognize that there are other DEQs in other states. However, I mostly work in Virginia, and this is the department that I work with. And so a lot of what I talk about, if I just happen to say DEQ without putting Virginia on it, most likely that's what I'm referring to. And then the third one that I might be using is DSE. It refers to the Department of Biological Systems Engineering at Virginia Tech. That is the department that I work in at Virginia Tech. I'm a faculty member here. I've been here for about 12 years, maybe a little bit more. And before that, I worked for an environmental engineering firm here in Blacksburg, Virginia. And I started there in 2001. So for the last 17 to 18 years, I've been working with developing TMDL our TMDL implementation plan. And most of that work has been done with the Virginia DEQ. I have to say I've been very privileged to work with DEQ. I think they're exceptional. Just want to go ahead and say that in case I forget to say it later. They are just amazing people to work with. And when I was asked to do this webinar on stakeholder engagement, one of my first thoughts was that someone from DEQ really should be doing this webinar because this is something that they excel at. But then after some thought, I realized that I work with DEQ on developing TMDLs and IPs. I work with them more on the technical side, but I have had the opportunity to work across the state and observe how the different DEQ staff coordinators engage with the stakeholders and the practices and the tools that they use for stakeholder engagement. So I do have that perspective, more of a statewide perspective about that. And I'm excited to share that with all of you. Okay, so here's my outline. I just have two major things, and one is very brief. I had said that I would look at some of the research that had been done involving stakeholder engagement and the implementation planning process. And unfortunately, there's not a lot out there, and there's not a lot of recent information, especially out there. But when I first was asked to do the webinar, I thought, I want to see what's already available as far as research, and then I could also learn something myself. So I will go over a couple things that I found, and then what we'll do is we'll move into more of a practical application, things that you can apply as you're developing IPs in your states. And I just want to say again that because I work mostly with Virginia, that the applications and the terms that I'm using or talking about will be mostly those that are used in Virginia. So starting with a review of literature, one of the articles that I found that I thought was interesting was this one called Adaptive Implementation of Water Quality Improvement Plan, Opportunities and Challenges. It was developed by a group at the Nicholas School of the Environment and Earth Sciences at Duke University, and it's from September 2007. And just some of the highlights as they were talking about stakeholder engagement that I just want to share. One of the things that the paper states is that there is no perfect long-term implementation plan. There's uncertainty in the whole TMDL process, from the monitoring to the modeling and the TMDL development, to the estimate of the source assessment, and then moving into implementation planning. There's uncertainty in the BMP effectiveness, uncertainty in whether stakeholders will implement the practices that are in the plan, because we all know that an implementation plan includes voluntary practices. So there's no way to know if the people are going to actually implement these practices to improve water quality. So the paper discusses an adaptive management plan for implementation. And it says in the paper that for the stakeholders that it could be frustrating to hear about all the uncertainties in the TMDL process. But if you begin your process at the very beginning, discussing with the stakeholders that this is an adaptive management process because of the concept of uncertainty, that they will accept that and be able to work with that. So it says here to focus on the goal of the TMDL process all the way through implementation, and that is to improve water quality. So as you're working with your stakeholders, let them know that certain controls, or anytime you put any type of control or of best management practice on the ground, it will move in the direction of improving water quality. So that was kind of their takeaway for stakeholder engagement. Another paper that I reviewed was called Approaches to TMDL Planning and Policy Tools for Implementation to Achieve Water Quality Standards. And this was a paper that was written by a group in the department I'm in, Biological Systems Engineering. And again, it was 2007. This is more of an inventory of TMDL IPs that had been developed up till that time throughout the whole country. So if you're looking for a resource, it's a little dated now, but it does have a list of some of the IPs that had been developed across the nation. And just some of the highlights of that in respect to stakeholder engagement. This paper also promotes an adaptive implementation, again, citing those uncertainties. It says, however, uncertainty will be reduced over time by observing how the water quality responds to the load reduction from the control measures. So that's it's an adaptive process again. So both of these papers I thought were interesting, talking about that there is no set IP. You always have to go back and revisit it. This paper also noted that successful implementation is linked to stakeholder involvement, and particularly the more successful implementation was linked to stakeholders who were empowered to make decisions about outcomes. So the more the stakeholders were involved in the decision-making process, the more successful the implementation. So I would recommend that paper. It also has a good reference, the literature review in different TMDL IPs. I thought that was very useful. And then the third item I want to talk about, third piece of literature that I found, was actually from this webinar series, and some of you may have already watched this, and if you haven't, I encourage you to. This was a presentation by Dr. Frank Dukes in 2016 through this series called Building Consensus for Better Water Quality Outcomes. And he wasn't talking specifically about TMDL IPs. He was just talking about stakeholder engagement and improving water quality. And I thought he had a lot of really good ideas on questions to ask your stakeholders and the do's and don'ts of stakeholder engagement. So it's a very worthwhile webinar, and I would encourage you to go back and revisit it if you haven't seen it in a while. So this chart was developed by the International Association for Public Participation. And this chart was in both the BSE paper and Dr. Duke's webinar. Both refer to this. I have an updated version here from 2019. But it shows how public impact increases the more options that the public has, from informing to consulting all the way to empowering your public participation. And I thought it was very useful, and I thought you might enjoy reading through this when you get a chance and using it. And I actually used it as I developed this webinar, kind of came up with some points based on this, and I think I'm going to try to start reading it every time I go into the implementation of the IP development process to kind of remind me of where we need to go and how we need to be working with our public. So that was the literature review. It's kind of brief. The more recent articles that I found felt like they were very circular. They just were basically referencing previous articles. And like I said, I was just looking for specifically for implementation planning. There are a lot of good articles out there about stakeholder engagement and the water quality improvement process, which would be applicable, I think. So let's move on to some of the practical applications of how to engage our stakeholders and what are the tools we want to use. So I just want to touch on a few things. One, we'll start off with this conceptual perspective on how to develop an IP. We'll talk about who are the stakeholders, what are the roles of the different types of stakeholder groups, and how are they engaged effectively. And this is something that it's more my opinion and things that I have observed over the years. And then the lessons that I've learned so far, because hopefully I'm still learning. So let's start with this conceptual perspective. And you notice I put the diagram that's on here. It shows an adaptive management plan, because that's it's interesting that the literature reinforced that when we're developing an IP, it is an adaptive management process. You have to develop a plan, you implement it, you evaluate it, and you go back, look at your plan to see what changes need to be made. So the sooner you can convey that to your stakeholders, that this is an adaptive management process, that the steps that we're going through to develop an IP, they're not set in stone, they're not going to be regulated. You want to do the best, to pick the best practices that are applicable and cost effective and will give you the benefits you need, but then you also need to be aware that those uncertainties are out there, and you just don't know who will, say, hey, I'm going to implement these plans or these measures, and you don't know how much funding is going to be available at any one time. So it is an adaptive management process. Okay, so who are the stakeholders? One group are those that are affected by the water quality problems. Another group are those that are actually contributing to the water quality problem. Then another group is ones that may have to install control measures. And here I have an example. This would be something like from a bacteria impairment, where on the left it shows a straight pipe, which is just a direct discharge of human sewage, probably from the toilets or from the house, directly into the stream. And the other one is an extreme case of a failed septic system, septic tank. And so there are some TMDLs that there are going to be what I call like prescriptive control measures that have to be done. And this is an example of one of those. If there's human waste going into a water body in Virginia, that's illegal. And those problems have to be corrected. A lot of control measures for TMDL implementation are, as I said, voluntary. There are different options you could use, but this is one of those that has to be done just legally and just for human health. So one of your stakeholder groups is that you want to try to have in your implementation planning is if there are these required control measures, you want to see if you can have people in your group or in your process that are going to be able to address these issues and help remedy them. Another group are regulatory water quality responsibilities, such as wastewater treatment plant and MS4 areas, or stormwater construction areas. Another stakeholder group are those that will implement actions, such as a business that replaces septic systems or a fencing company. Other stakeholders are those that live in the watershed and the ones that use the water. And then lastly here I have stakeholders are those that improve the chances of a successful implementation. And those are watershed environmental groups that are interested in water quality and improving the water quality. So that's a broad look of stakeholders. Now let's look more specifically. And so I'm thinking for most of these are, if you're the one that's developing an IP, these are the ones that you want to make sure are available or at your process. The first one, of course, is EPA. I don't know that they would actually be at the table at the meeting, but they are a stakeholder in that. The Clean Water Act comes from EPA. Most of the guidance for us on how to develop TMDLs and IPs comes from EPA, and there's also funding from EPA. So they are a stakeholder in this process. The other federal agency I want to mention is the NRCS, the Natural Resources Conservation Service. They would be a good group to have as you're developing your IP. That's someone that you would want to invite to be in on the process. They usually have local staff with it, that covers the watershed where the impairment is. They have technical staff. They have funding resources, grants or cost share practices, things like that. So they are a valuable stakeholder in this process. Moving on to state agencies, which state agencies would be welcome stakeholders to this process. Well, first is the state agency that controls environmental protection. And this agency is usually the one that's in charge of or responsible for developing TMDLs and TMDL IPs. So this group is definitely a stakeholder, and the primary stakeholder in most cases. So other state agencies that may be involved are any agencies that cover natural resources, conservation, parks, recreation. Depending on the impairment, the State Department of Health would be a good stakeholder. I'm thinking like a bacteria impairment, covering some of those septic issues. If, depending on, again, on the impairment, State Department of Forestry would be a good stakeholder to have. I know we have had good input in some projects that I've been on were for sediment TMDL, where there has been timber harvesting, and the Department of Forestry has been a good stakeholder to have there to talk about practices to improve that timber harvesting process. And then the last one I want to mention is just if there's any type of natural resource extraction that is part of the impairment or pollutant to the stream or water body, then you want to have some type of natural resource group or the agency that covers that in your as one of your stakeholders. Moving on to the local government to get more specific to the watershed itself. In Virginia, the Soil and Water Conservation District is a major stakeholder in this process, and that's because normally in Virginia, the SWCD is the one that's going to take over implementation of the plan once it's developed and approved by EPA. So they're the ones that are generally in charge of writing grants or working with stakeholders who are writing grants to get funding for implementation. They're usually the ones who are tracking implementation throughout the process. So they are, in Virginia, they are a major stakeholder that you want to be involved from the beginning. Other local government stakeholders are if there are any type of regional or district environmental planners or planning groups, any type of county or city departments that may be applicable for the type of impairment. And then cooperative extension throughout the country has county agents, and these agents are local. They most likely know the local landowners in the watershed. They know, they have outreach programs, they have educational programs, and they're a good resource to have as you're developing an IP to determine the best practices in a watershed. And then there are other stakeholders such as businesses, community groups, and citizens in the watershed or in the community that are interested in water quality improvement. And then I just have some examples here. So think of these, this could be helpful, like as you're coming up with a list of who you want involved in this IP development. These could be some sources that you want to look at. One are any environmental groups that are available or within the area. I'm thinking of those groups like Friends of the River, Friends of the River group, or Save Our Stream, Stream Watch, some of the river keepers, so things like that. Also, in Virginia, we have watershed roundtables, which cover large basins. So if you have something like that, so you don't need to always just focus on that local watershed, but think about the larger basin, and if there are stakeholders or some type of groups or organizations that are interested in water quality improvement on a larger scale, you could invite them to become a stakeholder. And then the animal groups here, this is one where if animals are contributing to the impairment, such as livestock or pets, and I'm thinking here more of like the Cattlemen's Association or some type of poultry association, but it could include, if there's a group of kennels, some type of organization for that. But if you can find some contact that would come and represent their groups as you develop, that would be a benefit. Farm Bureau is one of the businesses that may be a benefit. They have good connections. They know the local stakeholders. They know what's going on in the community. And then there are other local businesses that would be, you may think of that would be beneficial. Civic groups like Bruitons or Rotary clubs would be helpful. And they have a large group. They're organized. They can get word out about outreach. And then homeowner associations. So if you're impaired watershed, if it's in the suburbs and has a neighborhood, you may want to reach out to those neighborhoods to see if they want to be involved in this water quality improvement plan. Okay, so now we have an idea of some of the stakeholders. The next thing is, what are the roles of these stakeholders? And I'm showing here, this is the stakeholder engagement model that is used in Virginia. So it's, we have a resource team, a steering committee, multiple working groups, and that depends on the impairment and the interest of the stakeholders. And all of this goes to develop an implementation plan. So we see here the working groups work mostly with the resource team and the steering committee, and the resource team is involved in all the process. And I'll go through each one of these separately. So let's start with the resource team. And again, as I said, in Virginia, that is the Department of Environmental Quality. So I would assume that's the way it is for most states. It's going to be your environmental agency in your state. So they would be, I would say this is your core stakeholder, because they're going to be the ones that are going to drive the process. And so some other stakeholders that I would say would be beneficial on the resource team are the Soil and Water Conservation District. Again, as I mentioned, they're going to have a significant role in implementing the plan once it's developed. So think about your state if that's not the way your state's set up. I mean, who's the one, or which group or entities are going to be implementing the plan, and you want them on your resource team. These are the people that are going to start the process rolling. If you have a technical contractor to do the background work for the modeling or quantification of EMPs and things like that, they would be on your resource team. And then I have two groups down here. I have them in not solid line because it depends on the impairment, it depends on where it is, but it may be beneficial to have some county and city representatives on this resource team, and then some type of watershed or civic groups on the resource team. And they can help with getting the IP process started. So the responsibilities of the resource team are to facilitate stakeholder engagement. As I said, they're driving this whole process. They're the ones that are going to perform the technical analyses. Again, it may be a contractor doing that, or maybe the state agency itself. The resource team is responsible for providing the data from the technical analyses, and they're to get that to the stakeholder groups so that they can make informed decisions. So education is critical for this resource team. They need to make sure that the stakeholder groups that they're passing information on, that they understand the data and that they can use it to come up with an implementation plan. The resource team is the one that steers the process, making sure that it runs on time. They're the ones that are going to communicate the project update. They're the ones that are going to set meeting dates and run the meetings, facilitate meetings. They're going to make sure that the working groups and steering committee stay on task. And they're the ones that are responsible for meeting project deadlines. So as I said, one of the first tasks for the resource team is to set a public meeting so that they can have more people come in to be as stakeholders for this process. And so I will have to say, from my experience, one of the most effective or something that shows whether a IP development, how successful it's going to be, is how much effort is put into this outreach for this first public meeting. Because the more people you get at that public meeting, the more people you're going to get engaged in this whole process. So the outreach and how you advertise this first public meeting is very important. And that's one reason I said that it would be good to have a watershed or civic group in this process, because they're the ones that are going to have networking throughout the community and know how to get people engaged. They and also your county or city people will know, where's the best meeting facility, what times are best, or there are certain days of the week that are better to meet. What kind of meeting should it be? So that's why it's important to have them on board. So for outreach and notification to advertise your first public meeting, you can use email lists like listserv or some that you already have. One thing I was thinking is if the IP doesn't come too soon or too far away from the TMDL development, you could go back to your email list from when you were developing the TMDL and let people know, hey, we're ready to start planning the implementation now, and we'd love to have you join us. Mailings are effective, and I know sometimes you can't send a letter to everybody, every landowner in the watershed, but something I've seen that's effective is to send mailings to those landowners that have riparian areas. Because if you can get the riparian landowners to put practices in, it will really improve the water quality. Some of the stakeholders that I mentioned before, you may want to just pick up the phone and call them, depending on who they are, and actually be more personal about it and say, hey, we would really like you to be involved in this implementation planning. Newspaper articles, websites, flyers, you can put those, I've seen them in public libraries or grocery stores, hardware stores, anywhere that might have a venue like a bulletin board or something that you could post a flyer to advertise the public meeting. And then another one is if there are any community events that are preceding the public meeting, something like a county fair or a street festival, you may want to set up a booth or just, ask another group that's similar if you can put some flyers on their table so that you can advertise your event in the community. And then the last one I have listed here are signs in the watershed. These seem to be very effective. Put a sign, by the bridge if there's a stream that's impaired and that's what you're studying. That seems to draw people in as they're driving through the community to come to the meeting. So these are just some examples of ways to reach your public for that first public meeting or even any public meeting. And like I said, that this is crucial in getting your stakeholders engaged. You want to get a good, broad variety of stakeholders at your meeting, so you want to use different resources to get to them. So typically in Virginia, we have 2 public meetings, one to initiate the process, and then a final meeting to share the implementation plan once it's done. So for the first public meeting, it is more of an informational meeting. Tend to have people sitting in rows with a presenter. The facilitator usually is the state agency person at the front of the room talking to them. When you have these meetings, as I said, you want to be informative. So a couple things just to mention. One is, again, if you have these watershed groups or civic groups involved as a resource team, they may know of like something going on in the community that could be displayed or demonstrated at the first public meeting. An example I'm thinking of is in some that I've been to, they have asked students in either elementary school or middle school to come and if they have some type of science project that's related to watersheds or water quality, and they have come and displayed their project at the beginning of a first public meeting for IP development. And this encourages people to come to the meeting. The parents are usually there to see their children's displays. That's been very effective. in getting people out to a public meeting. Having engagement from the community is very beginning in different ways. So when you have your first public meeting, I would recommend that you have handouts, and that has your contact information on it so people can reach you after the meeting. What I've seen work in most cases is the first part of the meeting would be reviewing the TMDL, especially if it's been a while since the TMDL was developed. And then a brief description of the IP process and what's going to be involved, a timeline for that, an outline of what it is. And then the third thing I would say is end with an invitation to those people that are attending the meeting to join a working group. So you've described what a working group is, how its role in the implementation planning process, and then invite them to do that. And I've seen one way that's effective is if you already have some dates set for your working group meetings and have sign-up sheets, and then allow people to sign up and they know that the date. And then also make sure you have an option for them if they can't make it to that meeting, that they can also find out how they can be involved, at the next meeting. So those are just some ideas for the first public meeting. Okay, next we'll move on to working groups. So once you've had the public meeting, you've invited your stakeholders to come to these working groups. And so there are different ways to categorize your working groups, and it depends on the impairment, it depends on your watershed. So I've seen this done both ways, or different ways. One, I've seen the resource team, before they've even had the public meeting, they've decided, we're going to have these working groups, and they'll have a list of whatever that might be. I've also seen at the resource team wait until after the first public meeting to see what the interest is and what people might be interested in what kind of working groups they might be interested in. So that's it's interesting we talk about adaptive management, but I also think when you're developing an implementation plan, you also have to be adaptive depending on your stakeholders. There's no guarantee what kind of stakeholders you're going to get at the beginning. So you always have to be ready to work with what you have. For the potential working groups, here's just some examples of the way you could set up your working group. You could either do it by community, by the pollutant source categories, or by the pollutant itself. And I have to say that I have never been involved in an IP where the working groups were separated by the pollutant. And the reason being that I think is because a lot of control measures or BMPs are applicable to more than one pollutant. So the ones that I'm most familiar with is the pollutant source categories, where you have an agricultural working group and then a residential or urban working group. And then channel erosion normally are usually, for what I've experienced, is part of both of those, because the channel erosion is occurring on agricultural lands or urban or residential land. So I've seen that just kind of combined. So most of the IPs that I have been involved with have had two working groups, one agriculture, one residential. I have, at one time I was involved with a project that was, had a lot of the impairment was in a city, so they did have they had a residential and an urban, like a rural residential group and an urban group. Those are your options, though. So for your working groups, the responsibilities of a working group, they're responsible for identifying the best management practices or other ways to correct problems. They're responsible for identifying the probable locations of the problems. So these are the people that know the watershed and will be able to say, are the pollutant sources, are they scattered across the watershed? Are there just some specific places where there are problems and nowhere else? So that's the kind of things that they're going to be charged with looking at. Where are the problems and what practices would be best for those? So saying that, one of the things when you have your working group meeting, it goes back to the education. you want to present your working group with options for best management practices and description for those, so that they can understand, what type of practices can be implemented in their watershed to reduce the pollutant load. The working group is also responsible for identifying any constraints in the watershed. So there may be, I'll give you an example. I was working on a project recently, and they, I won't get into the details, but they were not allowed to put fencing within a certain distance of a stream through the floodplain. So that was a constraint for that project, where we couldn't really use livestock exclusion like we normally would because of those limitations. The working group is also charged with identifying potential sources of funding for the BMPs and developing a strategy to educate and involve stakeholders in the implementation itself. So part of what you need to have in an implementation plan is an educational component. So they are charged with that. The working group typically meets 1 or 2 times during IP development. This working group is a more informal group, usually sitting around a table to discuss ideas. So the third group, we have the resource team and the working group, and the third group is your steering committee. And the steering committee works, their work really starts after the working groups have finished what they're doing. And the responsibilities of the steering committee are to assess the input from the working group, and then to review the IP draft that comes from the working groups. So the working groups will come up with some plans for different types of best management practices, the costs associated with those. Then the resource team will develop an implementation plan based on the working group's ideas or decisions. And then they will pass that implementation plan, the draft, to the steering committee to review. The steering committee typically meets 1 to 2 times, depending on what's needed. And it's usually composed of at least 1 representative from each working group, composed also of the resource team, and then any other people that would like to be involved with it. So they're, as I said, they're charged with developing the IP or reviewing it and getting it ready for the final public meeting. Okay, so I'm not really going to talk much about the final public meeting. It's just a review of the IP. It could be somewhat celebratory that, hey, we have this and we're ready to start implementation. So I want to move on to things that I have observed for an effective stakeholder engagement. One that's at the top, the reason I have this top of the list is that it's the top of a lot of lists. And I asked some people, some DEQ staff, what do you think makes a good, how do you get stakeholders engaged? And if I got food. That was always, people said, have food. So if possible, when you're starting your IP process and that first public meeting, if there's any way to have some type of food at that meeting, I think you'll have more stakeholder involvement. People want to come out and eat, so offer a free meal. And that was another reason, I think, if you have a watershed group or a civic group on your resource team, they may know some businesses or groups that might donate food for your public meeting. Some of the things I've seen are chili. They brought out chili. One of the fire departments, I think, did that. So if you can have food, that engages stakeholders. They're very happy. Another one I know is that make sure the meetings run on time, that they start on time, and that if you've said, the meeting will be 1.5 hours or 2 hours, try to have that be your time limit. And I know some of the DEQ staff that I have worked with, they actually try to make the meeting end just a little bit before they said it would. Seems to make people happy. So be respectful of people's time when you're doing your working groups and your steering committee. And then utilize smaller working groups. Of course, you know, if you're the only one there, that's not really very effective. But here, I would say, and I looked this up and tried to find some research, and what I found for like a working group or a team in the research, it said between 5 to 8 people is a good number for a working group. And I guess I can see that. I think if you start getting too much larger than that, the conversations can become sidetracked, especially if you get like 15 people or more. I think it's possible, and I've seen it. I've seen effective working groups like that. But I just have to say that as the resource team or the facilitator, you have to be very intentional. You have to keep people on task. Don't let the conversation stray too far. You have to control those side conversations when you're in a larger group. So the groups I've seen that have been real effective are mostly like that, 5 to 10 people in a group. So what I would recommend is if you have a working group, and it seems to be larger than that, one of the things you might want to do is divide that group into 2 smaller working groups based on their interests. So just kind of scale down one more time to that level. I've also seen working groups where there's only 3 or 4 people, and you know, if they're the right people, they can be very effective. So don't disregard a group. You know, don't dismantle it just because you feel like you might not have enough people. If you have a working group meeting and you only have 3 or 4 people, don't think it's over, because I've been in situations where you know, the people that are there, they know everyone in the watershed. They know, you know, every piece of the stream that we're studying, and tell all about the problems there, what will work, won't work, what will work. So it's hard to say what is the right number of people in a working group. It really depends on who's there, who's showing up. Another thing I think is very effective throughout the whole process, if you bring maps of the watershed. We usually like to have maps that are like 3 by 4. If you have a larger watershed, you might want to have multiple maps. People like to go to look at the maps and see, you know, where they live in relation to the whole watershed, where's the impairment. It's just, at a public meeting, it really draws people and gets them engaged in the process. Then for your working group meetings, the maps are useful. You know, lay them on the table and everybody around it, and you know, looking at being able to identify problem areas or areas that may not need any work or any effort. They may be all forested and there are no pollutant loads in an area. So having a map or visual aids is very effective. And then the other thing is to educate as you go through the process. So the more you can educate your stakeholders, the more engaged they will be. And so some things that I just have here, if it's possible, take your working group on a watershed tour so that they can see some of the BMPs in practice. So if there's already BMPs implemented in the watershed or in nearby watersheds, it would be nice to go out and look at those. So when they're sitting in a room talking about BMPs, they have more of a visual idea of what those are. The other thing I would recommend is provide reference material. And I have an example here on the right. This comes from a working group meeting. And it's just a list of potential BMPs. This happens to be for agriculture. So, you know, educate your working groups on, you know, what type of BMPs are available, how they work in that regard. So here are just some lessons learned. These are more things that I picked up along the way. I've divided them into 3 groups. One is organization. I would say something I've observed, and I've mentioned this already a couple times, is that the earlier you can get watershed groups or environmental groups involved in the process, I think the better your IP is going to be. Like I said, they have connections. They have such an interest in improving.
Sorry, everyone. Seems like we have a bit of a technical issue.
Okay.
Oh, are you still there?
I am here. Can you hear me?
Oh, yeah. Okay. It was just a brief hiccup. All right.
Okay.
Yep. Keep going, I guess.
Okay. All right. The other thing is when you have your stakeholders gathered, particularly in the working group meetings, make sure you have meaningful tasks for them to do. That means, looking over the BMPs, coming up with which practices will work in the watershed, which ones might not, won't work, those kind of things. Make sure that they're fully engaged during those working group meetings. Again, I think I mentioned already about the time, schedule meetings when they're convenient to stakeholders. And then last for this group is provide structure, but be flexible. So as I mentioned at the first public meeting, you might want to put a tentative timeline so that people know how much involvement is, or what's involved, how much time is involved, when will they see this implementation plan get developed. So provide that structure, but recognize that things happen along the way, and be flexible with that. Again, we're back to adaptive management. As far as communication, the resource team coordination is essential. How you just stay in touch, have your whole resource team always knowing what's going on, what's coming up next, and always looking toward the future in the next meeting, the next task, the next deadline. Email and websites are low-cost, effective ways to reach your community and your stakeholders. And then last is that one size doesn't fit all. It's hard to say this is the way you need to communicate with your stakeholders because every watershed is different, every project's different. And for example, more rural areas, they may not access email or websites as often. And so you might have to think of more creative ways to communicate with your stakeholders in an area like that. And then finally, I have education. Again, like I mentioned, hands-on interaction is important. People like to see those maps. I would say make sure that your stakeholders are aware of the importance of environmental and watershed protection. So educate them on that as often as possible. And educate them on ways that they can reduce pollution. And a lot of people I've found, they get excited about implementation plans and being in the working groups, and they start working on implementation practices before the plan's even finished, which I think is great. And they start talking to people about maybe putting up pet waste stations, things like that. So as a facilitator, always look for those educational opportunities to excite your stakeholders. Having said that, be careful to inform without overwhelming. So example of that is at the public meeting, I wouldn't go into a lot of detail about how to quantify BMPs and how to look at costs and effectiveness. Just give your stakeholders what they need to know at the time to get them to the next step. And then last, I just want to leave you with this, that education is mutual, not just for the stakeholders. And I have found that every time I work on an IP, I learn something new, and it helps improve the process. So we're always learning, and it helps us all. And thank you for letting me talk with you today. And I guess if we have questions, we can do that now.
All right. Thanks, Dr. Kline. And if anyone has questions, now is the time to submit them through the chat. Let's give it a maybe a minute for people to enter, input some questions. And while that's happening, just a reminder that this webinar will be recorded and put up on NUIPIC's website, along with all of the others in this series, including webinar from 2016 by Dr. Frank Dukes that Dr. Kline mentioned early in her presentation. All right, so one question came in. Do you see the same process being effective with implementing toxic TMDLs?
Oh, that's a good question. And I think in Virginia we're starting to face that. I think the working groups would be different for toxins. I think you'd have to include more of industries or the ones that may be responsible for the impairments or the pollutants, more so than like your general local citizens.
Okay, great. Another question, do you have any experience engaging stakeholders during the TMDL development phase, and when would you say engagement has more success?
Oh, I think it's good to have them involved in TMDL development also. They have, maybe not at the same level of intensity, but I think a lot of what I talked about for outreach for public meetings, I think could also be applicable for TMDL development, the ways to reach your public, to have them come to learn about the TMDL process. So I do think it's important, and a lot of what I've talked about would be, I think, could be useful to also engage them in TMDL development.
So are the work groups and resource groups generally paid, or is it volunteer work? And if it's volunteers, how do you get them to be, interested in committing time for it?
Okay, they are volunteers. There are some agencies, I would say, like I mentioned the Soil and Water Conservation District. I guess they're, that's part of their job, and the state agencies would be part of their job. But most of your local citizens and watershed groups would be volunteers, and it's just because they're interested in improving water quality. Or, well, yeah, I was going to say, I mean, you also have, the landowners, they also want to be part of the process.
Do you have any suggestions as to what type of venue works best for those stakeholder meetings? For what?
Which kind?
Do you have any suggestions on what type of venue works best for any of these meetings?
Okay. Well, for a public meeting, maybe a larger area. Again, I think I mentioned kind of like putting rows of chairs. In Virginia, I don't think they have money to rent a place, so I've seen them have their public meetings. I showed some pictures of in a fire hall, in schools. They're good for public meetings. Then for the working group meetings, maybe a smaller venue would be better, more intimate, where people can sit around the table. Although those have also been, I've seen those in fire departments, rescue squad buildings, schools, libraries. If a library has a workroom, that works well.
Great. So kind of on that line, do you think hosting IP meetings before TMDLs are complete can be helpful?
I think I have, yes. I think having a TMDL move right into implementation planning, I've seen that be very successful in most cases, the ones that I have worked on and been involved with, because it keeps the momentum going. So I would say yes, that as the TMDL is wrapping up, that start the IP process.
Okay. And do you have any strategies for dealing with contentious stakeholders?
Oh boy. I think I will have to say that the people that I've worked with at DEQ have done a very good job of that. I could tell they've had facilitator training, which that's something I haven't had. I think be calm, be respectful. One thing I've seen the DEQ people do is sometimes they usually have at least two of their staff at TMDL or IP meetings, and sometimes one of those people, the one that's not facilitating the meeting, will kind of step aside with the contentious person and hear them out, hear what their problems are. That's one way to kind of diffuse the situation.
Okay. Have you ever seen or used online public IP meetings, or do you have any resources for an online meeting?
No, I haven't.
Okay. For larger watersheds, would you recommend multiple work group meetings?
I would. I think it's better if you have people that are local and know their watershed. I mean, that could be one way to break up the working groups is by location. If it's a larger watershed, to break it up into smaller watersheds for your working group.
If stakeholders, if stakeholders such as state and local governments have a compliance oversight for local and state laws not pertaining to NIPD's permits, does the IP address how these agencies will step up to oversight to address the non-compliance issues?
I think I've worked with one TMDL IP where we had a non-compliance issue, and it was not addressed in the IP, but DEQ addressed it through a different part of their agency. I think from my experience in Virginia, the IP only addresses those voluntary practices, and for the non-point sources that aren't under permit or regulation.
All right, I'll just give it a couple more seconds to see if there's any additional questions. And also for attendees, if you have any additional questions, there will be the opportunity to write them into the post-webinar evaluation. So I'm not seeing any other questions, so we'll wrap it up here. So thanks again to Dr. Karen Kline for this great presentation. And please be on the lookout for follow-up announcements when this webinar is, when the recording is online, and for announcements of future webinars in this series. So thanks everyone. Have a great afternoon.